but as long as I can remember, separatism has been just in the background and then in the forefront, but always around. When did this start?
Well, really, it started under Pierre Trudeau. Like when we go back to the history of Alberta, there's always been discontent on the prairies with the federal government, like right from the very beginning, like for more than 100 years. So during the early 20th century, there were lots of reform movements, like farmers' movements. And during the 20s, the Federal Progressive Party of Canada was the dominant party on the prairies, because people here turned to alternative parties. They turned away from mainstream parties. These were ways of dealing with their concerns with central Canada. And, that went on throughout much of the 20th century. But there was no movement for independence until Pierre Trudeau came into power. So I call him the father of the Alberta separatist movement because he created it through his policies. Like first with the Official Languages Act, which, made French more prominent here than ever before. Now that was kind of minor, but that was kind of the trigger for the first few people to create organizations. But the big change happened in 1973. There was a war in the Middle East, and the price of oil skyrocketed. It went from about $3 a barrel to about $12 a barrel in just a few weeks. So this was the beginning of the energy crisis. So Pierre Trudeau, because Alberta was going to be raking in so much money from its oil finally, Pierre Trudeau put an export tax on oil so that Alberta's oil exported to the United States, much of that revenue would go to the federal government. Now that was unprecedented in Canadian history, and our Premier Peter Lougheed called it the biggest ripoff in Confederation history because the federal government was taking money from Alberta's. This was our resource. We should be getting the money. But Trudeau also put a lower price on oil in Canada than the world price. So whether Alberta sold its oil to the United States or whether we sold the oil within Canada, we were getting much less than what we should have. So throughout the 1970s, our Premier Peter Lougheed was fighting with Trudeau over oil pricing. Alberta was getting, pretty good revenue, but a lot of that revenue was going to the federal government that shouldn't have. And then, there was a federal election in 1980 where Pierre Trudeau was coming back. And during that election campaign, and this is very significant, the Liberals explicitly campaigned against Alberta during that campaign. It was the most regionally divisive political campaign in Canadian history. I think it's a significant precedent, where the famous line from Keith Davey, the Liberal campaign activist, was "Screw the West, we'll take the rest." And that's what they did. And so right after they were reelected with that divisive election, they brought in the National Energy Program. And that was the biggest trigger of all for the organization of the separatist movement in Alberta. Like that's when it went big really big for the first time. And we ended up with, in 1982, there was a by-election where the Western Canada Concept Party elected one of their members to the Alberta legislature. He was the first and only separatist ever elected in Western Canada because of that uproar of the National Energy Program and because of Pierre Trudeau. Now, after Pierre Trudeau ended up leaving, of course, in 1984, and eventually he's replaced by Brian Mulroney, and the movement started to die out because we thought, well, all of Alberta's members of parliament were with the Progressive Conservative Party, and Brian Mulroney was a Progressive Conservative Prime Minister, so everything is going to be fine for the West now. He's going to get rid of the National Energy Program and so on. But there was a very significant event in 1986. Canada had bought the CF-18 fighter jets, and those needed to be maintained by particular facilities. And there was only two cities in Canada with those facilities, Winnipeg and Montreal. So the government held a competition to see which city would best maintain the CF-18 fighter jets. So according to the government's criteria, Winnipeg won the contract. So Mulroney awarded it to Montreal, obviously for political considerations. So that created a very big uproar in the West, and that led to the creation of the Reform Party of Canada because people were so fed up. I mean, it was one thing for Trudeau to be beating up on us, but we felt betrayed because we had voted for this guy Mulroney and he backstabbed us. So it led to a very high intensity of discontent with the federal government to the point where the Reform Party was created. And in 1993, they'd win, most of the seats in Alberta and many seats in Western Canada. And, the idea of the Reform Party was the West wants in. And I really think that is the genuine feeling of most Albertans, even those who, right now are supporting independence. The West has always wanted a voice in the national government. That's been our complaint right from the very beginning. They don't listen to us. The Senate is set up so that we don't have a voice in the national institutions. And so that's why the Reform Party and others promoted the Triple E Senate, a Senate that would be elected by the people with equal number of senators from each province and would have effective powers. Like if we had a Senate like that for Canada, Western voices would be heard in the national government. We wouldn't be shut out and we wouldn't feel a need to leave. But, Eastern Canada was not interested in reforming the Senate. And that was one of the lessons we learned from the Reform Party is they don't want the West in. The people in the East don't want the West in, and they don't want to reform our institutions. But I do think that, like in our heart of hearts, most Westerners would be happy with the West wants in with a solution like that rather than becoming independent. But that's not an option to us anymore. Like, we tried that. The Reform Party shows that Westerners will
Right.
work very, very hard to make Canada work. But if we don't get cooperation from people in the East, we can't make Canada work for our, it doesn't benefit us at all. Like, we don't get our voice heard. So it's kind of like the separatist movement is the final step. It's the only other option we have. We don't have anything else. We can accept the status quo of the Liberal government beating up on us, or we can go independent. Like, there's no middle ground. Although that's what Danielle Smith is trying to reach, that middle ground. Well, good luck to her. but there's decades of history to show that that's not going to work. So one of the things about Pierre Trudeau is he's the one who made separatism credible in Alberta. Before 1980, when surveys were done about support for separatism, the survey results were always single digits, like 4, 5, 6% or something like that. But since 1980, all of the polls that I'm aware of show at least double-digit support. It might be as low as 15, 16% in the early days, but it's very common, throughout the 90s and more recently, to get at least 20% support, even 25 or more percent support for separatism. So it was Trudeau's government that gave separatism credibility in Alberta, a credibility it never had before, so that now people talk about it, it's not some kind of wacko idea like going to the moon or something. It's something that many Albertans are familiar with. And before 1980, it was not taken seriously at all, even though there were organizations that were going. It was Trudeau himself with his National Energy Program that gave credibility to the independence movement and made it a permanent feature of Alberta's political culture. So I think I might have drifted away from your question here, but I just wanted to,
No.
give a bit of that history there and explain that we've tried so hard. The West has tried so hard, with Senate reform and political reform and stuff over several decades. It's not a thing that happened yesterday. And so this is why, people who say we're upset because we lost one election, that is so trivializing what we're really concerned about. We've had decades and decades of things that have been done to us that's built up frustration. We have frustration that's built up over several decades. And it's kind of like that election was the last straw. You know what I mean? They don't want us in. They don't want a conservative government that would better represent our interests. And so it's kind of decades of frustration that have been set off by that election loss. So it's not just the election in itself that has created this current support for independence in Alberta.